Arkansas is now the first state to outlaw gender-affirming medical care for transgender youth. The Republican-controlled state legislature overrode Governor Asa Hutchinson's veto on House Bill 1570. The measure prevents doctors from offering minors transition treatments or gender-affirming surgeries, even with parental consent. It will go into effect later this year. With more on this controversial state legislation, let's bring in activist and cultural organizer Raquel Willis. Raquel, so help us understand what this legislation means for the young trans community who can no longer receive gender-affirming health care in Arkansas. Explain the type of medical services that are being denied to them. And I keep referencing that this was for people under the age of 18 if they had parental consent. I struggle to understand why, if your parents agree, that the state would prevent you from doing so.
Right. Well, I think a lot of the conversation around the type of health care that trans people have to access is often sensationalized and often so singularly focused on things like surgeries, right? And things that are considered maybe more invasive to a lot of people. But a lot of the medical transition is not necessarily about surgery, right? It could be about getting access to hormonal treatments, getting access to puberty blockers, right, which is a big thing, particularly for trans youth. And so I think that's one of the larger sticking points. But of course, there are so many other types of services, and these pieces of legislation really just are so demoralizing to trans youth who are already dealing with such a difficult time. There is still so much ignorance out there about the trans experience. And if a trans youth and their family finally get support from a medical professional, that's a beautiful thing, right? And so what we're seeing is a lot of these folks who have access to that health care will now have it stripped away. And I think that's a sticking point from the governor.
All right. So on Monday, when Governor Hutchinson vetoed this bill, he said that he was doing so because it was vast government overreach. I want to play a bit of what he had to say for our audience.
House Bill 1570 would put the state as the definitive oracle of medical care, overriding parents, patients, and healthcare experts. While in some instances the state must act to protect life, the state should not presume to jump into the middle of every medical, human, and ethical issue. This would be and is a vast government overreach.
So, as you know, Raquel, the decision by the state legislature ignores the lived experience of trans youth and recommendations by medical professionals. I mean, these are recommendations from medical professionals, doctors. So the question becomes, what sort of precedent does this set for transgender rights as a whole in the United States?
Yeah, I think that this sends a larger signal to other states that are seeing these pieces of legislation moved that this is okay, right? That it's okay to discriminate against trans people and particularly trans youth. I mean, we're still seeing fights in other states like Tennessee, West Virginia, and so many more. And so it's just really demoralizing. And I think we have to really have a conversation around the problem with trying to police people's bodies, all people's bodies, right? This isn't just going to affect trans youth. This affects everyone because in some states, these pieces of legislation build registries to police the bodies of all athletes.
So as of today, there are 28 states that have proposed at least one anti-trans bill this year. Most of those states are pushing bills to prohibit transgender youth from participating in sports. With all the headlines, you penned a letter with GLAAD in support of the trans community. Tell us about that and any advice you have for parents of both cisgender and transgender kids when approaching these types of conversations.
Yes, well, I think what was so beautiful about the letter, of which now close to 700 notables and leading organizations have signed, and thousands more other folks who just wanted to support the community. It's so important for us to send a signal that there are more people with the trans community than against us. and that more and more people are opening themselves up to understand the diversity of experience out there when it comes to gender. And so I think that's what we have to continue to do. When we are talking to trans youth and talking to all youth, we have to let them know that diversity is a beautiful thing, that we all have different experiences, we have different bodies, we have different identities, but we have to treat each other with respect, and we have to own that everyone deserves the right to self-determination and bodily autonomy.
The other thing that I find really interesting is that in these states where they're proposing such types of legislation, the way that they frame these discussions, Raquel, is I think for people it imagines that there's an inordinate amount of people that want to play sports, right? I mean, I think but they've not been able to find any examples. In other words, these bills are coming up, and when they're asked to provide examples of where you are seeing something that you might take issue with, they can't provide them. Well, explain that to me.
Yeah, I mean, we are living in a time when there's so much misinformation and disinformation. And I think we're also seeing kind of a ripping at the seams of these arguments, because this has been a long haul game, I think, for a lot of conservative lawmakers. I mean, just a few years ago, the big threat was that trans people should not be in restrooms. And so they saw that they didn't get a foothold with that fight, and now they're trying to make it about trans youth and take away those rights. So I just think that we have to be very clear that we need to be listening to trans people first and foremost on these issues, and not people who have absolutely no clue about our experiences.
We have to wrap it up. We got like 30 seconds, Raquel, but I just want you to perhaps just offer up some words of hope. I mean, could you and I have had this conversation on live television 20 years ago?
I think we could have, right? But I do think that our society was different. One of the things that keeps me hopeful, and this goes out to all trans folks, trans youth, and people who care and love us, is that there's a long arc of trans resistance in history. There have always been people who have expanded beyond gender norms and paved their own ways. And we really are windows of possibility into a world where there are less restrictions on all of us to be ourselves.
Windows of opportunity. I love it. Thank you very much, Raquel. Appreciate it.
Thank you.